The story begins with the infamous tale of the notorious Texas prison, the Wallace Unit, a maximum security facility in the heart of Texas. It was a place known for its harsh conditions, overcrowding, and a reputation for violence. This story focuses on one of the most shocking twists in its history: how a prison guard who had once been responsible for maintaining order ended up on the other side of the bars as an inmate. In the 1990s, the Wallace Unit was one of the busiest prisons in the state. It housed some of the most dangerous criminals in Texas, many of whom had been convicted of violent offenses such as murder and armed robbery. It was a grim place where corruption ran rampant and the lines between good and evil often blurred. Among the guards working at the Wallace Unit was a man named Timothy Williams. He was a man of average build, but he carried himself with an air of authority that was typical of prison guards. Williams had always been the type of person who took pride in his job, believing that he was helping to protect society from the worst criminals. He had worked at several other facilities before being assigned to the Wallace Unit, and his reputation as a reliable and disciplined guard preceded him. However, the reality of working at a prison like Wallace began to take its toll on Williams. The longer he worked there, the more he witnessed the dark side of the prison system. He saw how guards often turned a blind eye to violence between inmates or even participated in illegal activities themselves. Williams struggled with the corruption that permeated the facility but continued to do his job, convincing himself that he was still in control. But the tipping point came when an inmate named Marcus Harris, a notorious drug dealer, was transferred to the Wallace Unit. Harris had been responsible for multiple violent incidents in the prison system, and he had a reputation for being manipulative and dangerous. Williams, who had been tasked with overseeing Harris's arrival, began to notice that something was off about the new inmate. Harris quickly formed alliances with other inmates and started running his illicit operations from behind bars. He bribed guards, including Williams, with money and favors, ensuring his continued influence within the prison. Williams, though uncomfortable with the arrangement, found himself drawn into Harris's web of corruption. It wasn't long before Williams began taking bribes from Harris in exchange for providing information and turning a blind eye to his activities. As the months passed, Williams became more entangled in the prison's criminal network. He knew that he was crossing moral lines, but the temptation of easy money proved too strong to resist. He justified his actions by convincing himself that everyone else was doing it and he was just trying to survive in an unforgiving environment. But things started to spiral out of control when a violent altercation broke out between two rival gangs inside the prison. The incident was traced back to Marcus Harris, who had orchestrated the violence as part of his ongoing power struggle with rival inmates. The violence left several people dead and many others injured, and the authorities launched an investigation into the cause. During the investigation, it was discovered that Harris had been receiving help from inside the prison, including assistance from certain guards who were supposed to be keeping order. The investigators quickly zeroed in on Williams, who had been one of Harris's main contacts. The evidence was damning, and Williams was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting criminal activity. Williams, who had once prided himself on being a law enforcement officer, now found himself in the same position as the very criminals he had once guarded. The irony of his situation was not lost on him as he was handcuffed and escorted to the inmates' side of the prison. It didn't take long for Williams to realize just how different life on the inside was. He was no longer the one in control. The inmates now saw him as just another prisoner, someone to be exploited or targeted. He was forced to endure the same conditions he had once enforced on others, from overcrowded cells to the constant threat of violence. At first, Williams tried to maintain his sense of dignity, keeping his head down and trying to blend in with the other inmates. But his status as a former guard made him an immediate target. He was harassed, threatened, and even assaulted by other prisoners who saw him as a traitor to the system. His former colleagues on the outside turned their backs on him, and he found himself isolated in a world where trust was a rare commodity. As the days passed, Williams began to reflect on his actions. He realized that he had become part of the very system he had once sworn to fight against. The corruption, the violence, and the abuse of power, it was all too much. He felt ashamed of the man he had become and the decisions that had led him to this point. But Williams was not completely without hope. He began to understand that, despite his fall from grace, he still had the power to change his life. He started working in the prison's education program, teaching other inmates how to read and write. It was a small step, but it helped him regain a sense of purpose and dignity. As the years went by, Williams became known among the inmates as someone who had once been on the other side of the law but had chosen to redeem himself. His story spread throughout the prison, and while some still saw him as a symbol of betrayal, others saw him as a man who had learned from his mistakes and was trying to make amends. Eventually, Williams was released from prison after serving a portion of his sentence. He had spent years behind bars, but he had also spent those years working on himself. He was no longer the man who had betrayed his oath as a guard. He was someone who had learned the hard way about the consequences of his actions. When he was finally freed, Williams faced an uncertain future. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, and his freedom. But he knew that he couldn't undo the past. All he could do was move forward and try to make a better life for himself. He started working at a rehabilitation center for former inmates, helping others who had been caught in the same system of corruption and violence. He used his story as a cautionary tale, warning others about the dangers of getting involved in the dark side of the prison system. Williams's work at the rehabilitation center gave him a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he was making a real difference in the lives of others. The rehabilitation center was located in a small town outside of the city, and it focused on helping former inmates reintegrate into society. The center provided counseling, job training, and support services aiming to reduce recidivism by giving former prisoners the tools they needed to succeed outside of prison walls. When Williams first arrived at the center, he was met with skepticism. Many of the inmates and staff members questioned whether a former prison guard could truly relate to their struggles. Some of the former inmates resented him for what they perceived as his past complicity in the system that had kept them behind bars. But over time, Williams proved himself not just as someone who had been on the inside, but as someone who genuinely wanted to help others avoid the same mistakes he had made. His story became a powerful tool in his work. He didn't sugarcoat his past or try to pretend that he hadn't made mistakes. Instead, he openly shared his experiences with the men and women he was trying to help. He told them about the corruption he had witnessed, the moral compromises he had made, and the consequences that followed. For many of the inmates, hearing Williams's story was a wake-up call. They saw a man who had once been just like them, a part of the system, and who had fallen from grace only to find redemption through hard work and self-reflection. At the center, Williams worked closely with inmates who were struggling with addiction, anger issues, and trauma. He knew firsthand how easy it was to fall into a cycle of violence and self-destruction. Many of the inmates had been exposed to the same toxic environment he had once worked in, and he understood the psychological scars it left behind. He listened to their stories, offered guidance, and helped them make sense of their past actions in a way that could help them move forward. As time passed, Williams became known as someone who was not only empathetic but also practical. He didn't offer empty promises or idealistic solutions. Instead, he provided concrete steps for how to navigate life outside of prison. He helped them with resume building, job interviews, and even practical life skills like managing finances and maintaining healthy relationships. He knew that these small victories were essential for rebuilding lives that had been shattered by the prison system. One of the most difficult challenges Williams faced at the center was working with individuals who had been institutionalized for so long that they had trouble adapting to the outside world. These men and women had spent decades in prison, and for them, the thought of freedom was terrifying. Many had never known anything beyond the confines of their cells, and they struggled to make decisions without the constant supervision of guards. Williams had to help them navigate the complex emotions of freedom, how to make their own choices, how to deal with the overwhelming nature of everyday life. He spent countless hours with these individuals, talking them through their fears and helping them build the confidence they needed to take the first steps toward a new life. Over time, the center began to see positive results. The inmates who had been in the program for a while began to find jobs, reconnect with their families, and build stable lives outside of the prison system. Some of them even started volunteering at the center, helping newer participants with their own rehabilitation journeys. This sense of community was crucial in breaking the cycle of recidivism. Williams saw firsthand the power of second chances and how an investment in someone's future could change their entire life trajectory. But the work wasn't easy, and Williams often faced setbacks. There were days when it seemed like the progress made by the inmates could be undone in an instant. Some of the former prisoners relapsed into old habits, falling back into addiction or violent behavior. It was frustrating, and there were moments when Williams wondered if he was doing enough. But then he would remember his own journey, the pain, the mistakes, and the redemption, and it would fuel him to keep going. One of the most difficult moments in Williams's career at the center came when a former inmate named Leon, who had been doing well, fell back into his old ways. Leon had been out of prison for a year, working at a local construction company and rebuilding his life. But one night, he was caught up in a bar fight and the police arrested him for assault. Leon was devastated. He had come so far, and it seemed like everything was falling apart. Williams sat with Leon in the rehabilitation center, trying to help him understand what had happened. He didn't offer judgment or condemnation. Instead, he reminded Leon of how far he had come and helped him look at the situation as an opportunity for growth. It was a difficult conversation, but Williams knew that it was moments like these that truly tested the effectiveness of the rehabilitation process. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress, and even setbacks could be stepping stones toward change. As Williams continued to work at the center, he gained a reputation as a dedicated and compassionate mentor. He wasn't just a former guard, he was someone who understood the intricacies of the criminal justice system and the deep scars it left behind. His unique perspective allowed him to connect with the inmates in a way that few others could. He had walked the same path they had, and he knew how easy it was to fall into the traps of the system. His impact extended beyond the inmates themselves. The staff at the rehabilitation center also began to view Williams in a new light. Many had been skeptical of his past as a prison guard, but over time they came to see him as an invaluable resource. He helped them understand the mindset of those who had spent years in the prison system and the difficulties they faced when reintegrating into society. He worked closely with counselors, psychologists, and social workers, offering his insights and advice to ensure that the rehabilitation process was as effective as possible. Despite the progress he had made, Williams never forgot his past. He knew that the prison system was still broken and that many people, including himself, had been victims of its flaws. He became an outspoken advocate for prison reform, using his platform to speak out against the corruption, violence, and systemic issues that plagued the system. He was passionate about changing the way prisons operated, advocating for more rehabilitative programs and lessening the emphasis on punishment. Williams's advocacy for prison reform was not without its challenges. Many of his former colleagues in law enforcement viewed him with suspicion, considering his past and his outspoken stance on reform. But Williams remained undeterred. He believed that the only way to truly fix the broken system was to acknowledge its flaws and work toward a solution that focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Through his work at the rehabilitation center and his advocacy for prison reform, Williams began to gain national attention. His story was featured in news outlets, and he was invited to speak at conferences and forums on criminal justice reform. He used these opportunities to share his message of redemption and hope, urging lawmakers, prison officials, and society at large to rethink the way they viewed those who had been incarcerated. The attention brought with it new challenges, as Williams was constantly navigating the delicate balance between his past and his present. There were moments when he was criticized for being a former guard, and some questioned whether he was truly capable of understanding the plight of those incarcerated. But Williams took these criticisms in stride. He knew that his story was complex and that the work he was doing was a step in the right direction. In the end, Williams's story became a testament to the human capacity for redemption. It was a reminder that even those who have fallen from grace can rise again, as long as they are willing to confront their past and make amends. His journey from guard to inmate and back to society was a difficult one, but it was also one of self-discovery and growth. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story of forgiveness, both of others and of oneself. Williams found peace in his work. He had dedicated his life to helping others avoid the same mistakes he had made. He had become a symbol of redemption, not just for those who had been incarcerated, but for anyone who had ever felt like they were beyond saving. His journey from guard to inmate to mentor had come full circle, and he knew that he had found his true calling.